If you're struggling on the SAT English section like so many other students, let's talk about 5 tips that can help you boost that score. Tip 1 is to do your easiest questions first. Now, this is going to depend on you. Some questions will be easier for some students than others, but as a rule of thumb, go ahead and start with these words and context questions. They tend to go quickly if you know them. These will usually be the first 4 or 5 questions. So if I jump to question 4 here, we've still got words and context. Once I get to 5, boom, we've moved on to main purpose. I would move past these main purpose questions. Honestly, what I consider the reading type questions, I would skip past, move on ahead to around 14 or 15, where we get to conventions of standard English. For this one, it's going to be 15. And then here you'll have another stretch of questions that go more quickly. So if I go all the way to 20, we're still there. If I go to 22, okay, it looks like rhetorical synthesis. So that would be my suggestion. Start with words and context, skip ahead to standards of conventional English and bust through those. And then after that, once you've racked up those points, go back, start working on those questions that are going to take a little bit longer. And tip number 2 is to eliminate or cross out wrong answers. You can do this with the cross out tool on Blue Book, but let's take a quick look at how this strategy makes it very easy to confidently answer a question. We're looking at a rhetorical synthesis question here, and for that reason, I'm going to ignore the notes. They're not going to help me. All I need to do is focus on the goal. In this case, the goal is to present a study to an audience already familiar with environmental DNA. So familiar with environmental DNA. I'm just going to go through and I'm going to eliminate answers that don't do that for me. A says Sarah's researchers analyzed eDNA in water samples from Florida for Everglades for evidence of invasive constrictor snakes, which are difficult to observe. So it does seem to be talking about a study, and I don't know what eDNA is, so it seems like it would be for an audience familiar with it. B says an analysis can detect the presence. Okay, this is just saying what an analysis can do. It's trying to explain something to me, but if I'm already familiar with DNA, I'm assuming I wouldn't need this explanation. So B is out. Researchers found Python DNA or environmental DNA in water samples. Again, it's telling me that eDNA is environmental DNA. If I was familiar, I should already know that. So I'm going to get rid of C. And then D, we've got they analyze environmental DNA. That is DNA from materials released by organisms. So again, this little parenthetical, this little bit between our dash sandwich is trying to explain stuff to me. If I was already familiar with environmental DNA, I would know that. So I'm going to get rid of D. And just like that, our answer is A. My next tip is to read only one sentence when you're dealing with punctuation or sentence boundaries. So here I'm only going to focus on this first sentence since it contains the blank spot. I'm going to go ahead and ignore this part. The Huntington Library in blank received a collection of, I don't need to worry about that either. So basically we have the Huntington Library in California received a collection. Now, my subject is the Huntington Library in California. So I could just think of that as it. And then my verb is received. It received. Do I want punctuation between my subject and my verb? Absolutely not. So for this one, I would go with D, but please remember to stick with my last tip and eliminate wrong answers if you are not feeling confident like I just was. It's certainly okay to skip that step if you are 100% sure, which in this case, I was. And you might have noticed that I was ignoring a lot of the text here other than just the sentence that I didn't focus on. I got rid of this part. I got rid of this part. So my 4th tip is to ignore certain things, namely intros, long-ass subjects, parentheticals, and prepositional phrases. This last part here that I ignored is a prepositional phrase. And if you've got a really long prepositional phrase like this one, it's just going to bog you down, especially if you're working on conventions of standard English. So a lot of the time you could ignore those. I also crossed out this little parenthetical, this little comma sandwich. Let me show you another example of that. So this one is another great example. And just to explain what I'm talking about, a parenthetical is something that can be put in parentheses. It's basically non-essential information that's split off from the rest of the sentence, indicated by either 2 commas, 2 dashes, or a set of parentheses. So see if you can spot the parenthetical here. That's right. We've got a dash here and another dash here. So this is a dash sandwich. So I can definitely ignore all this stuff. And from the answer choices here, I can tell that I'm dealing with verb tense. So I'm going to see if I can get away with just reading this sentence first. It was there that Price premiered her first symphony and blank supportive relationships. Okay, so it was there that Price first premiered. So this is simple past tense. I want simple past tense, which is be. And as you can see, getting rid of that parenthetical made it a lot easier for me to read through and make that connection. And let's talk about the other two things that I mentioned that we haven't gone over yet. The introductory phrases and the long subjects. Here we've got an introductory phrase, and we know it's an introductory phrase because we have some sort of a phrase, a comma, and then the main subject. So a comma doesn't necessarily mean an introductory phrase. You need to identify that the main subject comes after the comma. So what I would do here is I would get rid of in a 2016 study. And then speaking of the subject, this is a long ass subject. It says Eastern Washington University psychologist Amani L. Aleli. That is a lot. What I would do is I would say no thank you, and I would just narrow it down to one or two words. So the main idea here would be something like this psychologist, right? And then I'm kind of thinking in my head, this psychologist. So that would be a great example of a really long subject that you want to simplify. Now see if you can spot the other things I would eliminate in this sentence. You can pause the video if you want, but yep, you guessed it. I'm getting rid of all this because we have another parenthetical. We actually have a parenthetical within a parenthetical. We've got the comma sandwich, and then in that we also have the parentheses sandwich. So now we just have this psychologist found that there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high on: openness to experience. And for this one, I also have a pretty confident answer, but I'm going to go through the elimination steps just to show you what that would look like. So for A period is supposed to separate two independent clauses, right? If I look at the supposed sentence starting from on, we get on openness to experience. That is definitely not a sentence, so A is out. With B, we have something similar going on because a semicolon acts like a period most of the time. So what would that read like? Well, after on, we would get openness to experience. Openness to experience is literally just a noun phrase. It's not a full sentence. So again, that's not going to work. C, there's no punctuation. So what would that look like? This psychologist found that there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high on: openness to experience. No, no, that doesn't work. It's a run-on. So C is out. And by process of elimination, it is going to be our colon, D. And if you want to know more about what colons do, leave me a comment. I'd be happy to make a dedicated video, but I knew right off the bat that this was going to be a great answer because one of the things that colons do best is resolving a cliffhanger. So you can see we've got this cliffhanger. The psychologist found out there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high on. And then you're thinking, what is that one trait? Cliffhanger gets resolved with openness to experience. All right, and my final tip for the English section is the odd verb out trick. You're going to like this one because we actually don't even need to read the text for this trick. So if you identify from your answers that you're dealing with subject-verb agreement, all you have to do is add a pronoun and test them to figure out which one is the odd verb out. Let me show you what I mean. First, we're going to choose either he, she, or it. It could be any of those three. I'm going to go with she for this one, and then they. And you don't necessarily have to write this down. I'm just showing so you can see. And then you go through your answers and you match up with either she or they. So for A, I would say she hasn't been. For B, I would say she wasn't. For C, I would say she isn't. And for D, I would say they aren't. So what's the odd verb out? It's the one that's different from the others. D, they aren't. And that is the odd verb out trick. Just to show how this actually works, if we were to look at the paragraph, we could actually get rid of this prepositional phrase. We can get rid of this parenthetical, like we just talked about in tip number 4. And we basically have the artistic talents aren't limited to the realm of prose. So plural, they. You can see that there is indeed a match, but this is a really nifty trick. Just remember, if you have more than one answer that works, that means you're dealing with tense instead of subject-verb agreement, so then you will have to go back and check on the text. But let's not forget about the math section of the SAT. This video right here is going to cover 5 tips to help you get closer to that dream score.